I'm Susan McDaniel, and I'm going to moderate this session on defining individuals and collectivities. Who are we? I am an adjunct professor of sociology at the University of Victoria. The recent popularity in Ancestry.com and similar genetic background search organizations, along with growing interest in one's roots or families of origin, raises a lot of questions about the centrality of genes and searching for ancestral identities to personal and collective identities, and the complex intertwining of social, ideological, biological, cultural dimensions of human identities and categories. So this session is a quite exciting one in my view. We have people from different disciplines who have different takes on these important questions. And the plan would be, excuse me, for each of the four panelists, for each of the four panelists to speak for about 7 minutes each, because we have an hour, and then we will open it up for questions. And I would encourage anyone that has a question to put it in the chat box. We may not be able to get to all the questions, but we'll do our best. So welcome everyone. And our first speaker will be Vadid Ravinsky, who is a professor in the Department of Social and Preventive Medicine at Université de Montréal. So Vadid, over to you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Pleasure to be here. So I'd like to make a few comments that set the stage for the rest of the discussion. And to start by pointing out that DNA ancestry testing is a booming industry. Last year, it was a very, very popular Christmas gift. It will probably be the same this year. So there's a lot of economic interest. We won't focus mainly on that. I want to start by looking at the language used to advertise these tests on the company's websites that use phrases like discover what makes you uniquely you, or discover your DNA tribe, or even learn about your ethnic origin. So what is the message that the public is getting when this language is used? And while people are really drawn to these tests, it's pretty intuitive to understand the interest in this information. People maybe want to discover relatives, understand where biologically they came from. There are obvious risks associated, and they're often overlooked. So I want to look at a few of them, and then step back and look at the broader philosophical, ethical implications of these tests. The first risk that is often acknowledged is privacy. So where does your data go when it sits with this company? Who has access to it? Is it identifiable or not? And even if it's not, even if it's just aggregate data, do you care that it might be sold, that some other companies might make commercial use of it? What about research use? Do you feel that you should give consent if your data is used in aggregate for research? What about government use? We all heard recently that police was granted access to a company's database for forensic use, and a murderer was caught, identified and caught many years after the crime was committed based on information that was gleaned from the website. Are users fully aware of these implications, whether they're commercial, research, government, or forensic? Maybe they're informed about this in a very lengthy consent that they click on, but who really reads these long texts that we were all familiar with from companies? So the privacy concerns and who has access to your data is one cluster of issues. There's another cluster that I would call personal or family risks. And this has more of a psychological flavor, more of a narrative tone. And this is often about secrets revealed. So for example, somebody didn't know that they were adopted, and this testing reveals this, maybe at a later age. Maybe the parents are no longer there to ask them questions, to ask them why they haven't told. Cases of sperm and egg donation. So when genetic relatedness is absent from the family, these things can be revealed. Or finding that you have a half sibling that you never knew about. So finding a third cousin that you didn't know about could be, the source of great joy. But finding that you have half a sister can raise interesting questions with your parents. I was recently at a conference where a law professor told a heartbreaking story where ancestry testing revealed to her that she has a half sister that she didn't know about from her mother's side. So when it comes from the paternal side, you think, okay, maybe the father didn't even know, but from the mother's side, turns out her mother was raped when she was a young woman, left to have the baby in secret and gave the baby up for adoption and never told a living soul about this, not even her husband and current children. And now in her 80s, the mother was confronted by her daughter and had to face something that she buried for decades. Are we really aware of these risks when we use these tests for fun, for entertainment? So these stories are emerging now almost every week, and I think it's very important for users to be aware of potential, again, what I call personal or family risks of secrets revealed and relationships challenged. And finally, personal identity risks. I want to share with you that many years ago when I was teaching at UPenn, one of my students told me that he's getting his DNA tested for Ancestry. It was very rudimentary at the time. And I said, why does that interest you? And he said, well, I'm adopted and I want to learn more about my true religion. And that blew me away as an answer. He wants to know more about the DNA to know his religion. So people make links between DNA and identity that are sometimes surprising to some of us. They can be very personal links. People can seek to learn more about their identity in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of their sense of belonging to a community, and even in terms of culture and religion. But now I want to step back from these sort of three clusters of risks or concerns: the privacy, the personal family, psychological issues, and the personal identity. Oh, and about personal identity, what I meant was that some people who for their entire lives identified with a certain community can get a result that says that they don't belong to that community based on their DNA and have a serious identity crisis. You self-identified as Black, but most of your DNA is white. What does that mean? What impact does that have on the story that you tell yourself about your identity? So when I step back from these three types of risks, I want to ask the more fundamental question of why do people want to know this in the first place? Why does it matter to them? Even if it's just for entertainment, why do we even care about these things? So I think that has to do with the place genetics plays in our culture. DNA is a symbol of our humanity, our heritage, as what connects us. It's linked to our dignity for some people. That's why we're so scared of gene editing. So to give genetics such an important role, such weight through ancestry testing can have dangerous ethical and political implications. I'm supposed to end, but I'll steal an extra 30 seconds. It can have a psychological impact on families that are not genetically linked, maybe making them they can be viewed as inferior or less legitimate because they don't have that genetic link. It can have an impact on a legal impact on our rights. For example, impact on immigration, on our rights to belong to an indigenous community, on our rights to be identified as belonging to a minority that entitle us to certain benefits, such as affirmative action. And of course, the risk of giving race a biological flavor that it shouldn't have. So each of these things opens its own Pandora box of issues. And my goal in these opening comments was to highlight the fact that the popularity of these tests is in itself not innocuous, because it reflects a set of cultural assumptions and values that can be harmful to individuals and to society. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ferdinand. I said this would be interesting, and I think we're already very interested in what's going to be said next. and by the next three speakers. Okay, the next speaker in the lineup of four is Julia Crete, who is a professor of English at York University and also a filmmaker. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Susan. And Vardit, I'm really just going to echo in some ways what you've already said. First of all, I'm going to start with a shameless plug. This is my recently published book called The Genealogical Sublime, which is actually about databases, the genealogy databases. I became fascinated by the databases because I spent, the better part of a decade going down the rabbit hole of family history. And when I surfaced, and this was in the 90s, and when I surfaced in the early 2000s, and I was one of those people who, who traveled extensively to go to archives, and I was trying to puzzle together a family secret. So much of, genealogy is driven by those questions of family secrets. Anyway, when I surfaced from that, I realized that everybody was doing it, that I was part of a zeitgeist. And I became very curious about the industry itself. I became curious about whether my motivations were actually my own, because family history and genealogy feels like it's the most intimate thing we can, the most intimate story we can tell about ourselves. But when you start to realize that we are, one person among millions and millions of people worldwide that are all of a sudden invested in this notion of family history and the need for this narrative, then I think, one becomes a little bit more quizzical about how those motivations, what's motivating us. So I decided that, since I was a researcher, I would start researching the industry itself. So I went to the largest databases I could find. And one of the largest ones, one of the most significant ones, was actually in Iceland. And Iceland is really the canary in the coal mine, I suppose, when it comes to genetic genealogy. So the Iceland Database, and Iceland is so interesting because it has records, genealogical records that go back to the 9th century. Susan, you may have to time me because I forgot to start my timer. Anyway, so they have these fantastic paper records, but the genetic records, and the reason that Iceland became a genetic laboratory was because of a company called Decode Genetics, who decided to use the genealogical resources of Iceland and combine it with a genetic database to produce essentially a research database for tracking genetically inherited diseases. Now, on the one hand, that was, a fantastic research concept. It was started by a man named Kari Stephenson, who found that the constraints of Harvard were too much for him. So he went into the free market of Iceland, and people invested heavily in this company, in Decode Genetics. So Iceland became the first place to have an almost complete genetic picture of a nation. Now, what happened, and this is why I say it's the canary in the coal mine, is that Decode Genetics went bankrupt in 2008 and had to then sell the genetic database, the genome of the entire country of Iceland. And they ended up selling it to an American company called Amgen, who then sold it on to China. So Vardit, your observations about, the unpredictable nature of what will happen to our genetic material that is sold or donated or that we, give, that we pay to have analyzed, we cannot predict where that information will go. And I think that's one of the very serious consequences of the popularization of direct-to-consumer genetics. And I do think that Iceland is the prime example. The question, who do you think you are, is, I think, a very pernicious question, because it implies lack. It implies that we need to buy something in order to understand who we are. It's the same consumer, sort of consumer motivation used for any other product. Without this product, you won't be whole. So the companies use exactly the same strategy. Who do you think you are? Well, you lack something, obviously, because you can't answer that question, or you're missing something in that question. Now, up until 20 years, 15 years ago, well, the direct-to-consumer market only really started about 15 years ago, max, more like 10. Up until then, we didn't need an answer, a genetic answer to that question. We had all kinds of ways of answering that question without having to take a genetic test. I have 1 minute left. So we have to understand, and I think Vardy laid it out very clearly, that this is a very contemporary notion of needing to know who we are, with really unpredictable consequences. And so I have made it, I made a documentary called Data Mining the Deceased, and I've screened that documentary around the world. I've talked to about 50 groups, and every time I say to them, think twice before you give away your DNA. You are giving away much, much more valuable information than you will get back. And people really have to puzzle through that question. But I think it's incumbent on us to really promote that question of what or promote the idea that what we give away is much more valuable than what we get in return. So that's my I could go on for hours and hours about the industry. 2 very small points. One, it's entirely driven by the Mormons. And secondly, all the information is being sold to the pharmaceutical industry. And the law enforcement has now accessed those databases about 300 times. That's my short spiel on the industry.
Well, thank you. It's fascinating, just fascinating. So keep up the good work. And so far, this is very interesting. Looking forward to the next two speakers. The third speaker, and queue up your questions, please, listeners. The third speaker is Kim Tallbear, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. Over to you, Kim.
Hi. I wanted to start with a quote, but before I do that, the previous 2 comments led me to remember Susan Lindy, who is a historian of science. I think she's at Penn. I saw her a couple years ago at a conference, and she said, because I wrote about this in my 2013 book, these DNA testing companies, she said in 2017, I think it was, more genetic ancestry tests were sold than had been sold in all previous years combined. I've been researching this field since the mapping of the human genome began, or since I got involved in that in 2000, started looking at the first DNA testing companies that came online in early, probably 2002-3. I was shocked because I'm like, why isn't this an old story? This is not a story anymore. It's still a story, and it's a still growing story, which fascinates me. So, but the quote that I like to start with often when I'm thinking about these topics, a zoologist, I think he's from Australia, Peter Dwyer, and he wrote somewhere that and this is a quote, the idea of evolution has conditioned an odd understanding that we are what we were and not what we became. And I like to talk about that because a lot of my work I realized in the last 5 years is really all about relations and relatives and how we relate to one another in an ongoing dynamic way. And so when I started, I published a book in 2013 called Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science. And that book talks about DNA testing companies. It talks about the phenomenon of genetic genealogy. Family tree research was the #1 pastime in the United States at the time. #2 was gardening. It's probably still similar. Ancestry.com hadn't even come on board with its own ancestry tests, I think, at the time I published this. A lot of the companies that emerged in the early 2000s are no longer around. 23andMe has now taken over a lot of the territory. So the world has gotten glitzier, and it's become much more widespread. But I was always interested in the imposition onto Indigenous people, since I got into looking at this stuff in 2000, of what I call settler colonial of kinship. And so this notion that lineal biological descent inherited patriarchally, by the way, because this is one of the reasons that genetic ancestry tests, why chromosome tests are so popular. They go along with the inheritance of men's names, right? And so there's a very kind of patriarchal grounding to a lot of this, whether geneticists know it or not, but it's certainly played in their interest to have that be the case. So I was really pushing back in my early research on this topic, on that imposition of settler notions of kinship, family, patriarchy, their definitions of what constitutes indigeneity, because a lot of this industry by the need to sample tens or hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people before we vanish into a sea of admixture. This is the story even before genetics came on the scene. The idea that Native people are vanishing into a sea of mixing before the word admixture occurred. This goes back to the 18th century. So geneticists are building what seem like innovative, contemporary, high-tech research projects on long-standing notions of race and Indigenous disappearance, and that bugged me. So that's why I wrote that book. You know, I wanted to sort of call out the fact that, yes, official racial science may have disappeared around World War II, when scientists got wind of, you know, the horrors of what was happening in Nazi Germany, and they realized the complicity of biologists in the US and the UK. But race didn't really disappear as an object. It transformed into the concept of population. And historians of science have written about that. There's some new stuff that is seemingly anti-racist, multicultural, and inclusive about population, but there's still a whole lot of old school racial baggage. And that's what I talk about in that book. Well, then 5 years ago, I kind of stopped working on genetic stuff. I really was putting my energy into a program that I was on the founding faculty for, the summer internship for Indigenous Peoples and Genomics, and Laura Arbor, who's next, is also involved with us in helping do some of that work. And that's a training program for Indigenous people to either who are aspiring scientists or who have to think about regulating genomics within their communities. And I've more been focused on supporting the work of Indigenous scientists in the last 5 years. My own research, though, has taken a turn towards another form of relating. And my next book is on non-monogamy, and I'm looking at critical non-monogamy, not the kind that Alexis Shotwell, who's a philosopher, calls, a feminist philosopher, she calls polyamory as monogamy on steroids, rules, rules, rules. And so when I started looking at non-monogamy, because I'm a non-monogamist, I was also interested in how both monogamy and non-monogamy in a settler colonial world again impose settler colonial notions of family, of relationships, of what counts as a legitimate way of relating. And that's bugging me again. So my next book is going to actually take on people may think non-monogamy is some critical kind of new thing, but it's still embodying old school settler notions of what counts as legitimate family. And so I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from a paper I've got coming out in my next minute and a half. And this is from, I've got a chapter coming out in a critical Indigenous studies volume where I'm going to be making the links, the way I've transitioned from DNA, researching DNA and kinship norms and their imposition onto Indigenous communities, to researching non-monogamy and compulsory marriage, compulsory monogamy, and those impositions onto Indigenous communities. And this chapter is called Identity is a Poor Substitute for Relating. I also hate the word identity. I'm very allergic to it. So I'll just talk about why that is. And then I go through from genetic ancestry to polyamory to notions of property and relations in this, and I'll read you one paragraph. As a concept in popular usage does not necessarily imply ongoing relating. It might imply discrete biological conjoinings within one's genetic ancestry, and it can spur alliances. But it can also exist as a largely individualistic idea, as something considered to be held once and for all unchanging within one's own body, whether through biological or social imprinting, as one's body's property. Similarly, I don't want those of us who practice consensual non-monogamy to calcify our practices and relations into individual identity claims that risk us looking too much within our own persons, including our genetics, for a definition of who we are. Rather, I want us to remember that we are always becoming, in relation not only to genetic and cultural ancestors as anonymous, but to one another continuously, and in relation to the geographies and political economies we inhabit, whether by choice or by circumstance. So I want us to think about ongoing relating, not only with our human, not always biological relatives, but also our ongoing relating with the planet. And so to me, identity inhibits us in its human-centric, individualistic connotations from doing that. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Kim. It's clear we're going to have a lot to talk about in the questions, so this is just great. And I have some questions too I'm just dying to answer. The next speaker, though, I won't cut in here, is Laura Arbour, who is a professor of medical genetics at the University of British Columbia. Laura, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, the rest of you on this panel. A lot of food for thought already. And so now, Kim, I'm nervous about using the word identity. So, but I will persist on. So I'm a clinical geneticist. So I do think that I'm seeing things through a slightly different lens than the others here. So I see patients with genetic conditions. So at every patient encounter, I'm able to ask, tell me, or I'm able to say, tell me about your family. And what I've learned over the years, the last couple of decades, is that within these families, identity is very complex. Sometimes it's about ancestry, sometimes it's about disease, sometimes religion, sometimes politics. But the genetics literature also supports that it's incredibly unique to each person. Two siblings that were raised in the same house and had the same parents will identify differently. So identity is very unique to each of us. In the context of direct-to-consumer ancestry studies, as a clinical geneticist, there's really not much of an impact. I think the impact is more social in the way that all of you have described. Every now and then there is a discovery of a relative that actually may even help with clinical information that someone did not know about. So it doesn't have the same impact within clinical genetics. But the question, who are you? Who are we? Who am I? And then who are they? I'd like to talk a little bit more about who are they, and that's imposed identity, and why I think that in itself has led to health disparity. So I'm the lead of a project called the Silent Genomes Project. This is a large-scale applied research project. This is okay, sorry about that. I think we've got some. Okay, so this is, it's a national project. It's about addressing healthcare disparity from a genetics perspective for children with likely genetic conditions. There are many challenges to access and genetic healthcare for genetic children, for Indigenous children with genetic conditions. But even if we bring Indigenous people to the table, even if they are able to access care, there is also a stark absence of reference data that is very important for genetic diagnosis. So just to give you a bit of background about that, for every time there are many genes that are sequenced for someone who has hereditary cancer or someone who has another possible genetic condition or an undiagnosed condition, reference data is important, and reference data changes according to population. And there is an absolute stark absence of data from Indigenous persons. And so what this does is it leads to health disparities, so that precise diagnosis will be much more challenging for that. So why are Indigenous people not represented? There are many challenges. These large databases are made of sometimes disease databases. I'm really interested in Julia's documentary, Data Mining and Disease, because in fact, some of these databases were built from the disease databases or other research databases. Indigenous people may not have been involved in those projects, and some of that may have been because of choice. So when we think about genetic technology and ancestry and technology to discover ancestry, it's the same technology. And this is a concern, because some 30 years ago, when that discovery was made that you could actually use that same technology to discover ancestry, there was a flurry of activity, and a number of Indigenous communities and Indigenous samples were targeted to answer the question, who are they? This is imposed identity, as opposed to anybody who actually sends their $200 themselves and takes all those risks that Vardit was talking about. This is imposed identity. And that has led to mistrust, and that continues, and pretty well had continued on to just maybe a couple of years ago, or maybe it still does. Because of that, and because of the concern with data access, and data release, as I've been consulting with Indigenous communities across the country about would they be interested in participating in our background variant library that is so important for diagnosis. And the concerns are great. The concerns are, could there be safe release of that data? Could there be secondary research without us knowing about it? We know that those same data points can be used to discover ancestry, and that's not our priority. So how can we be sure that that's going to be protected? And so for this, what I'll say is that as we are working on in the Silent Genomes Project, the solutions lie with us. The solutions that are important to consider, to listen to the concerns with self-determination, with data sovereignty, with the history of that importance, and not just to invite as inclusion, but to ensure that our rules of inclusion encompass all in their concerns. So as a clinical geneticist, my concern is access to genetic healthcare. And this is where I see the problem, and I see the problem of the imposed identity of who are they that has really led to a good part of this. So thank you for letting me participate in this conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. I don't think it's a question of letting you participate. You've added a different perspective, which each of the panelists have done. So I think it's very exciting to contrast and think about these very, very complex issues. So what I would ask is a couple of things. First of all, if people could put any questions you have into the chat box, I think it would be easier. And then I will try to queue them up so that we can answer. I think among the panelists, there will be a lot of discussion too, but I don't want to start there because that would take up, time, and other participants may not be able to answer questions. So let's queue up in the chat room, and if you're not speaking, maybe you could mute your microphone, because what happens, I've discovered in teaching on Zoom, is if you don't mute your microphone when you're speaking, everybody hears you talking to your kids and your dog and the neighbor and the postman and everybody else. So, and sometimes you hear the recycling trucks going by. So it's useful to mute the microphones when you're not speaking. Okay. I see one question here I will pose for now, and then we'll move on. It's from one of the panelists to another panelist. So we'll start there until we get more questions. I'd love to hear more about the industry and what and who drives it. Vardit is asking, I think, Julia.
Yeah, I was asking Julia, she mentioned Mormons, and I'm really curious about pure financial interest versus more complex sets of interests.
Was that for Julia?
Yeah, that was for Julia.
She looks like she's frozen.
Julia, can you hear us?
No, obviously not.
No, I guess
I think
not.
while she's reconnecting, yeah, the Mormons have been involved since the beginning because they're such, oh, here she is, expert genealogist. But yeah, Julia, that's for you. Go ahead, because I haven't researched this in 15 years. So.
Can you, Julia, could you hear the
Sorry,
question? It's like it's down again. Don't you love technology?
No, but they're such expert genealogy researchers, right? And they do everybody's genealogy, not their own. I heard, because I've worked for Native Mormons, so I'm going on what they've told me, not because I've actually done the extensive research. But they have a big interest in just
internet is so able. Yeah.
Can you hear us, Julia? She's locked again. This is not so good anyway. So Kim, go back to you, please, and we'll.
Oh, yeah. So there's a big interest in doing genealogies on the part of Mormons because I hear from my Native Mormon science and technology politics people that they apparently will baptize people as well after death. So, but there's anyway, I'm sure Julia has more recent information, but yeah, Family Tree DNA is a Mormon run company. And I don't know how well known that is among people. They had one of the largest Native data sets because they're also especially interested in Native people, Mormons, for religious purposes that are found in their doctrine. So yeah, they're central. Go ahead, Julia.
Unmute, Julia. Unmute.
Yep.
There we go.
So I interviewed the CEOs of the Mormon database, and then I went to interview the founders of Ancestry. And what the founders of Ancestry told me was that they would have never had the success. Ancestry would have never gotten off the ground if they hadn't been Mormons. And the reason is, so Ancestry was started as a Mormon company. That is that they were marketing databases on CD to Mormons only, because the Mormons have a doctrinal imperative to do family history. The reason they do it, and I don't know whether you said this or not, Kim, but it's in the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith invents the doctrine of posthumous baptism, that families will be reunited in heaven. But in order for that to happen, they have to be rebaptized on earth in proxy ceremonies. So the genealogical records were gathered to allow Mormons to have baptisms for dead Mormons or for dead relatives who could then be converted to Mormonism. So the entire Mormon project, which starts in the late, they start gathering genealogical information in the late 19th century, is to support this doctrine of posthumous baptism. So when the industry starts, and Ancestry is really, you know, they're the ground floor of the industry itself. The industry starts because of Mormon interests and because of the records that the Mormons have already gathered. But they also drive the industry because every company kicks back information to the Mormons. So the Mormons allow companies to share their databases, and the companies feed them the family trees. Now, they're more interested in records right now, but they're moving into the genetic space. And the financial interests in Ancestry is located, the head offices of Ancestry are a kilometer away from the head offices from the Family History Library, the Mormon Library. The workforce of Ancestry is 99% Mormon. It's owned by a private equity company, so you can't know who actually owns the company. But it's no question that the financial dealings between the Mormon Church and Ancestry, I mean, they're deeply, deeply imbricated. So when I say that it's an industry driven by the Mormons, every other North American database has been motivated by Mormon interests and continues to be.
Thank you. Could I just add one quick thing there? Well, actually, two quick things. Academics, you know, they always have to add two quick things. The first one is that all of us are in the Mormon database. You don't need to be Mormon to be in it. They research everyone on earth. And so their records are huge. They also do these, as Julia is indicating, these baptisms of the dead. So that means that it's been quite controversial because some of the baptisms have been of Holocaust victims who have been then baptized into the Mormon church long after their death in concentration camps. So you can imagine that a lot of this is very controversial. At the same time, they have huge genetic databases that a lot of people access, not just Mormons. It's quite an industry. There's a question here, which I think is quite interesting, from someone who does, I'll just cue it up, from someone who does brain imaging research and wants to know what Canadian law covers in terms of protection and privacy of brain data. Does anybody know an answer to that? Or any other kind of data that we collect about people, personal data?
Laura, maybe you know?
Vardit, I was going to refer to you, but what I guess certainly.
I think one of the issues, I'm not a legal expert, but what I've heard my legal colleagues say on other panels is that if you are providing a genetic sample because it's a part of a diagnostic process when you're getting care, you're protected. Your privacy is protected because it's medical information. If you're participating in a research study, such as in the case of Laura, as a research participant, you're protected. But when you are paying for it, and it's what we call recreational use, and you are sending to commercial entity, it's very unclear what the protections are, and that the companies are legally allowed to sell the aggregate data onwards to other commercial entities. So again, the question becomes, once it's been passed on to another entity, are you identifiable as an individual, or is your data just aggregate? Unclear, but when you buy a test online for fun, you lose the protections that you would have had if you were a patient or a research participant, as far as I understand.
Yeah, and so I would agree with that, except I think the question, I agree with everything that you've said, but I think the question is asking something slightly different. So in the chat, my impression is that the person writing this is carrying out research on neuroimaging. And they are wondering about the protection of data from neuroimaging, which would, I assume, be research data, compared to genetic data, and whether there are laws. And I would, and this person is adding a little bit more. So I would say that this falls under, our Tri-Council policy statement on research data in general for protection. But there are implications of genetic information that is different than neuroimaging, because neuroimaging is about the person, and genetic implicates the family and the community and beyond. And so that's where some of the differences may lie.
Sorry, here, I'm not muted. Never sure when I'm muted. There's additional question in this, which I think is important, but almost separate. Somewhat separate, allied, but somewhat separate. And that is the question of the use of genetic material that may be floating around in databases for denial of health insurance, or to say there are pre-existing condition or genetic anomalies, so you get denied for health insurance. And I think that's something that would be, I'm not sure who would be more appropriate to ask that, so I'll just throw it out and see if we could try to assess that a little bit.
So Julia has responded, and I think Vardit would be able to talk about the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act either.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a law in Canada that says that you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of genetic makeup. I was going to say genetic defects, but I think that's the wrong language. You know, your genetic composition. So a health insurance company can't deny you coverage on that basis. But, and here's the big but, if you do a recreational test or direct to consumer test, and you ask for, you know, because 23andMe has a ancestry side and it has a medical, you know, susceptibility, you know, your susceptibility to certain diseases based on genetic profile. If you ask any of these companies, and Ancestry is now doing medical testing as well, to do that kind of testing, and you get the results back and you're told that you have a higher percentage, you're at higher risk for certain kinds of diseases, and you don't disclose that information to an insurance company when you're asking for research or insurance, then they can come back to you. If you then develop the disease, and they can come back to you and say, well, wait a minute, but you did this test and surely you knew. So you can't unknow. And this is something fundamental to genetic testing. And this is, you know, the companies have these disclaimers on the site saying, you cannot unknow what we're going to tell you about your genetic makeup. And I think the question of what you might find out about your health is a tricky one when it comes then to the future of you know, your insurability.
Another issue is with life insurance. You cannot be denied, but they're not obligated to insure you for any amount. So there's a threshold beyond which, if you want to be insured for a particularly high amount, genetic information can block you on that. And that's for actuarial reasons. Insurance companies need to be viable, and so they have that exception. It's a matter of amount. So people sometimes are not aware of it, and they think they are completely free of limitations, but that's not the case. And the second issue with employment is what we call hidden discrimination. So somebody has access to your genetic profile, and they know that you're a carrier for Huntington and that your life expectancy is lower. So they don't want to hire you, but they can't say the real reason. So they'll come up with another reason and claim that you're not suitable for the role because you missed a certain skill, or they'll just make up another reason. And then you're discriminated against in a legal way, but that discrimination is hidden. So the risks are, even with a law, some risks still remain.
Interesting, very interesting points. There's also the issue of travel and travel insurance, which we're not doing much of now, but when we do travel, fill out these applications for travel insurance, and you wind up in a jurisdiction which is not covered by our health insurance. And some of this previous knowledge might come to bear on whether you're eligible for being insured for traveling. So I think there's insurance, there's healthcare insurance, but then there's other kinds of insurance too, as we're discussing life insurance and travel insurance. I have a question, and I don't know whether I'll pop in here, but I think I will because I don't see another question queued up immediately. The question of relationality, I'll use that term that Kim used, is something that I've used as well. And since you use the term things that bug you, this is one that bugs me, is when people talk about generation X or generation Y or generation Z or something like that. My argument is that you're talking about cohorts. You're not talking about generation. That generation is a relationship, so that you can be a mother to a daughter or a granddaughter to a grandmother, and that can change over time. You know, as your relationships change, but cohort is set. You're born at a certain time. So I keep talking about generationing as a process, and it drives people wild. But the notion that circumvents identity as well, because you're not identifying as a cohort, you're identifying as a relational person, as a person in a relationship. So that's an aspect that I worry about, how to address, how to escape from this immense focus on identity. And so I really enjoyed what you said, Kim, and I wonder if you would comment on my generationing concept.
Well, I'm intrigued, but I don't quite get it. So so you're attaching the concept of generation to what the relationship is versus a set period in time.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a great way to do it too. I just yeah, I don't, but do you feel like us attaching generation to a set period in time is somehow undermining a more incisive and robust use of the word generation? Is that your critique?
Yes, that's true. What I'm doing is paralleling it in some ways, but it's a different kind of a concept, that relationality matters more than when you were born, and when you were born does not determine identity. It's more based on relationality, and that involves generationing. So you learn, and this was brought up earlier by someone, so you learn about who you are through your family relationships. Laura brought it up. And you might be in the same family, but you might not see family the same way. So you learn who you are by relating.
Yeah. I mean, I think I have a somewhat similar critique of the sort of generational type, you know, because there's a lot of memeing around about Gen X versus boomers. I mean, I've heard a lot of Indigenous people say as well. Who's the we that's the boomer you're talking about, right? Because that's not the cultural or class characteristics that were necessarily available to us, right? So I wonder if that's another way of saying that often when people are talking about the boomer generation, they're talking about a certain intersectional race and class type that doesn't apply to everybody, right? And that might be partly also getting at the use of those terms in ways that are not very robust in terms of them accounting for actual lived relations. I think that might be similar to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I could sit there and talk to you for an hour about it to sort of get more insight into what you're saying. I think it's really interesting.
I think so. I tend to think this is the beginning of a long conversation we all might have and produce some kind of new project. Does anyone have thoughts on the concept of cultural appropriation, which kind of twinges into your genetic determination of whether you can represent or say something about a certain group?
Don't get me started.
Well, it has recently been a political issue in the US with a certain politician disclosing results as a way of getting sort of credit for a belonging to a certain identity, and then the backlash to that. So I think the interplay, I'm not naming any names, I think the interplay of DNA results with community identity, be it racial or ethnic or indigenous, is volatile from an ethical and a political perspective. So I mentioned, for example, the possibility of universities demanding a DNA test if you claim minority status, which would be accompanied with certain very real tangible benefits. Laura maybe can tell us more about Indigenous groups considering DNA as one way to affirm, confirm, validate identity. In the immigration context, somebody posted in the chat for family reunification and granting citizenship rights or immigration rights, starting to use DNA tests. That's already happening, and it's exceptionally dangerous. So for me, there are just like red flags all over the place when we allow and accept the use of DNA, not just as proxy, but as a validation of claims about identity. I wish we were not going there, but it looks like we are. And that conflates notion of race, ethnicity, and biology in ways that are historically charged, ethically charged, and I would argue plainly wrong. So I'd love to hear other panelists' thoughts on this. I am very kind of black and white about my position. I think it carries a lot of risk and hardly has any benefits because it's scientifically unsound, it's politically dangerous, it can lead us down a path of eugenics, of racism, and other grave social harms. So here, I put my opinion out there, and I'd love to hear others react to it.
So I will make a brief comment and then turn this over to Kim, who's much more informed on it. What the conversations that I've had are really interesting across the country, because some have asked whether they could use the background variant library exactly for those purposes, to somehow override the Indian Act, so that they know that they will always be who they are. They've always known that, but they want more evidence to be able to show if somebody comes and challenges them. So those questions have definitely been asked in a way, how can you help us with this? Because we're focusing only on health, that's not something that, that we would be doing. We know that many people would not participate if it could be used for that reason. And there's also a number of communities that are working with partners who are researchers, or they themselves are Indigenous researchers, to answer some of the questions of, instead of who are they, who are we, but under the control of them carrying out the research themselves. So I think that there are, just as you mentioned, there are great concerns with the idea that you should be using DNA as inclusion or exclusion. But there are a lot of people thinking about it in many different ways. So I'm going to hand over to Kim because she's way more informed on these issues than I am.
Kim.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Laura. I'm interested to know more about people wanting to use some of your data for counteracting the damages done by the Indian Act. That's fascinating. Just quickly, tribes in the US, first don't use genetic ancestry testing as far as I know. They're pretty confidential about what they're willing to disclose, because their citizenship criteria are often have confidentiality around the documentation. Because it doesn't help them link up somebody to that particular community, because genetic ancestry testing does not show tribal or people-specific markers. It only shows, probable ancestry in that continent or region, right? And we've got thousands of Indigenous peoples across the Americas, distinct peoples. But what they do use is parentage testing, which is very different than the genetic ancestry testing. And I think a lot of times the public doesn't understand that. Parentage testing is actually combined with their genealogical and documentary rules. So it kind of plugs into a broader set of rules, which I have a lot less trouble with, both scientifically and politically, than I would with genetic ancestry testing. But the public who's non-Indigenous thinks that genetic ancestry matters, even when tribes and First Nations push back and say not really. And since there are many fewer of us than there are everybody else, the scientific or the cultural power of genetics and genetic ancestry tends to prevail in the public imagination. And as you said, Vardit, I think that's the problem. I mean, my number one set of trolls in 2018 and 2019 were Democratic supporters of Elizabeth Warren, because I was outspoken about her misguided genetic ancestry testing and the publication of that, and the PR of that, really totally problematic. So, yeah.
Okay, there's one last question. It's a rather complicated question on the chat, and then we're running out of time, so we have to close off soon. But I think what I'll do, it's Janice Williamson is asking the question, so maybe what I'll turn to her to pose it to us. But maybe we could do it briefly, because we're running out of time, unfortunately.
Janice, you're still muted.
Maybe I will have to put the question.
Okay, I'll just say, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate all of your commentaries. And I think I quite deeply understand the risks involved in these corporations and genetic material. At the same time, I just sort of wanted to make a plug for those millions of people who are looking to sort of story their narratives, and suggest that some of that impetus is in fact very disruptive of the kind of constricted understandings we have of family and kinship that is strictly biological, as well as, you know, the history of settler colonialism. Like, I discovered my great grandmother was the domestic servant to the British general who received the information from Laura Secord, and you know, and lived in Windsor Castle. Like, these things are so fascinating, precisely because I see myself implicated in Indigenous history, where the Mohawks fought off the American soldiers in the War of 1812. So I guess I just want to say something affirmative about some of these impulses to make these connections, and they're not all, you know, and they are sometimes very productive.
Susan, since we're concluding, I really wanted to jump in and say that I think the benefits are so obvious and the proof is in the pudding. Millions of people are paying out of pocket for this. So I think we dedicated all of our energy to the why not, to the risks, to the concerns, because what you said is so intuitively obvious to huge parts of the population. We're fascinated by our histories. We want to know biologically where we came from. It feeds into our narrative. So we totally acknowledge what you said, but that's sort of more intuitively easy to follow.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's excellent. That's an excellent note to end on. I was seeing that similarly, but it's very good to have that other side articulated quite importantly. So I want to thank the panelists immensely for coming together to talk about these issues. Very complex. We weren't given enough time, but that's not our fault. It was good to have people here, and it's lovely to see so many people coming by to participate and listen with us. So one new message here. I don't know whether we can go to a new message. Great discussion. Many thanks from Chad Gaffield. Yay. I would thank you too. It's been wonderful, and I really appreciate your willingness to talk quickly and to raise so many important points. And I look forward to talking with you again. Thank you very much, everybody.